Good afternoon and welcome to the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. We're pleased that you can join us today for today's discussion on bridging the congressional divide, bipartisan action on climate change. I'm Bill Loveless, the co-host of the Columbia Energy Exchange podcast aired weekly here at the center. Legislating on almost any topic in Washington these days is difficult, especially when it comes to an enormous issue like climate change. Yet that topic is getting more attention than ever these days from Democrats and Republicans alike, as the risks of a warming planet become that much more apparent. So far, much of the attention in Washington focuses on proposals by President Biden and other Democrats to reduce carbon emissions across the U.S. economy to net zero by 2050, including a goal of making the electric power sector carbon-free by 2035. But there are other measures in the works too, including one by a Republican representing West Virginia coal country and a Democrat from coastal Oregon. It's called the Clean Energy Future Through Innovation Act, one that they say stands a better chance of bipartisan approval in Congress than proposals with stricter measures. Today, we'll hear from these two lawmakers about their proposal and why they think it stands a chance of gaining traction on Capitol Hill. But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes to make here. This event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available in coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the Congressman at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching this live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CGEP Live, that's CGEP Live, or the Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. And I'd just like to make a note too that while we're talking about clean energy options, I'd like to recommend Energizing America. It's a book by several scholars here at the center that calls for the federal government to triple its clean energy R&D spending in 5 years and sets out a roadmap for doing just that. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce Representative David McKinley of West Virginia and Representative Kurt Schrader of Oregon. Representative McKinley is one of two professional engineers in Congress and represents West Virginia's 1st Congressional District. He's done that since 2011. Across the U.S., we find U.S. Representative Schrader, a veterinarian by trade, who has represented Oregon's 5th District since 2009. Well, gentlemen, we look forward to the discussion today, and perhaps we can start with just a general look at this bill. We can start with Congressman McKinley and then hear from Representative Schrader.
You're on mute, David.
Yep, there you go.
There we go. Thank you. I'm technologically challenged, Bill, on this thing. So
we all are.
Before we jump into that, I think we need to frame the argument a little bit, because what we're dealing with in Washington is a mindset. It's kind of on energy. Essentially, I think I see this fight across America, but it's centered here in Washington. Is we've hit a fork in the road, Bill, and that is, do we continue using with fossil fuels as well as nuclear and renewables to maintain a base load and be able to continue? Or in 2035 or by 2050, are we taking the other road, the left side, and just simply doing away with fossil fuels? I don't think that's, I'm uncomfortable with that. Because doing away with it, yes, you can do that, but that's a simplistic route that doesn't use our innovation, things that we could do. I want to keep, so I'm back on the other route, which is let's keep all our fuels available. This mantra that people talk about, using all of the above. I want to continue doing that and use our innovation so that we lower the CO2 molecules into the atmosphere. I'm there. I've been saying for 11 years now that we have climate change and we've got to address it. But I think what it's going to be important on this is we've got to do it in a bipartisan fashion. And that's why I'm so honored to have Kurt Schrader on this bill with me. We've been working on it now for over 4 years to get this thing up to where it is now. And what we're talking about on innovation. Actually, the other title that we use, a working title that I use, is innovate first, regulate later. So that let's let our research laboratories, our colleges and universities, let's do the government, let's everyone come together to find out how the best way that we can maintain our energy security with reliability and resiliency in our market by using all of the above. And that means a lot of money into wind and solar and hydro, biomass. I'm fine with that, but we don't want to walk away from our fossil fuels. Now you can, but I'll just say, I don't think that's very humanitarian, because we have a lot of communities across America that they're just one industry towns. They're either coal mining, they're gas companies, gas operations there, and you do away with that. I want everyone to slow down, think about, this is not a laboratory experiment we're doing. We could be decimating families, separating, causing them to sell their homes or move someplace else. So I want us to be careful about what we're doing. That's why I'm going to continue to do this. Innovate first for 10 years, put a lot of money into the research, and then move forward with it.
Right. Congressman Schrader.
Thanks, Bill. I think David set the framework correctly. Rather than fight over fossil fuels versus renewable energy, isn't our goal to reduce carbon emissions? You know, if we accept the premise that our major goal to save our planet is to reduce carbon emissions, we shouldn't care, what the energy source is, as long as they are part of a very serious plan to get to near zero emissions over a defined period of time. In our carbon emission standard bill, we picked the year 2050. I think we could negotiate on that, obviously. I think 2035 is a little optimistic and probably unrealistic. But I talked to energy companies, and some are able to move quicker than others. So David and I thought, well, let's not pick winners and losers here. If you can get your carbon emissions down in the power plant sector, that's where our bite-sized chunk is, it's a pretty big chunk, but power plant sector, we can get your emissions down over 85%, basically to near zero emissions. No matter what fuel source you use, you're good to go. You're good to go. You've done your part. But to David's point, and frankly, Bill, to your center's point, we need to make huge investments in innovation and technology in both the renewable sector. I mean, battery storage is still, imperfect at this point in time, and maybe carbon capture, carbon sequestration. I talked to engineers other than David that say it's actually real and can happen. So let's do it. Let's make not just triple our investment. We're talking tens of billions of dollars of investments in our bill, both on the renewable sector side and on the fossil side, to do the innovation and technology that will get us where we need to be. The other huge advantage, besides it being both a Republican and Democrat behind this initiative, is that we finally set this in law. Instead of waiting or ping-ponging back and forth from one administration to another as to what they think is right, frankly, Congress is the institution set up by our forefathers to determine what the laws are supposed to be, what our goals are supposed to be, not the president, with all due respect. So we actually set this in statute. There will be a carbon energy standard that'll start to take effect within a 10-year window. And even within that 10 years, all these power plants have to show a trajectory to reducing their emissions. That's monitored in our bill. That's laid out in our bill. And I think that would be huge. That would give industry and environmental groups the certainty and the metrics by which to measure, are we getting where we need to go? And if we're not, then we got to make changes, Right. But rather than put in all sorts of new regulatory frameworks and try and force this and force that, let's put our effort into the innovation and technology, have some glide path to getting us to those near zero emissions, and have a standard set in law that everyone can bank on. You can make your investments and know they're going to be good, solid investments. You can have a trajectory by which you can monitor industries' ability to do that, hold them accountable. I think it's a win-win. We've reached out to industry groups, we've reached out to environmental groups, and there's a ton of interest in in doing what we're talking about here. So I welcome questions and to get into.
Well, you make on that point of comments. I noted that the bill, when you introduced it last year, and I understand you'll be reintroducing some form of it again this year. The bill was applauded by a wide range of groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the United Mine Workers of America, National Wildlife Federation, Center for Climate and Energy Solution, and utilities like Duke Energy and Southern Company. Congressman Schrader, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that 10-year period when the utilities would have to begin to aim for that emissions target, that 80% CO2 reduction by 2050. What happens within that 10 years? What happens with the Clean Air Act and new performance standards and the requirements that are currently set in that law?
Well, the requirements that are currently in place stay in place. We would not be promulgating any new Clean Air Act standards because we'll have this instead. And I think it's every 2 years, I have to recheck myself, but every 2 years, there's a rolling average of what the carbon emissions are from the different power plants and different sectors, and they're monitored. And the secretary's charged with monitoring, are we meeting intermediate benchmarks to get us down to where we want to be by, at least in our bill at this point, by 2050 in terms of the emissions from our plants. And then if that's not happening, then there's the opportunity to go back and frankly, potentially go back to regulation if companies are not following through on that. But on the flip side, we have to be sure in Congress that we are putting the money out there so that these companies, both on the renewable side and on the fossil side, have the opportunity to make the investments and frankly, get the resources. Another advantage of this that I think we should talk about at some point is that if we can develop this technology, we can sell this technology to the rest of the world. We're not going to cure climate change here in America alone. India, China are huge contributors. The EU, if we can come up with the technology and innovation here, frankly, we could sell it to other countries and make our country not only energy independent, but economically free and be a great win-win for Americans.
Congressman McKinley, the Republican leaders in the House now have sort of outlined where they would go with climate change regulation this year. Obviously, would not go as far as the Democratic proposal that's been introduced in the House of Representatives, but nevertheless, there is some groundwork being done there. Have you spoken to leaders, for example, Republican leader Kevin McCarthy and others on energy and commerce and all, to get a sense of whether you'll get some increasing numbers of Republicans to support you in this effort?
Oh, that's a fair question. I think the realization is that Republicans right now, our bill is just a messaging bill. When you're in the minority in the House and in the Senate, you don't have the presidency, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to embrace what we're doing. But we want to show that there are some solutions out there. So that's what, and as part of that bill that was introduced last week, I think it was, and we put an op-ed out on that. It talks about some of the Republican priorities, but it's not going to get there. What we're talking about, Kurt and I have, is something that's bipartisan. We have support over in the Senate. We're going to be able to push it. I've got a meeting this week. Kurt and I both have a meeting this week with Frank Pallone to talk about how we might be able to do it, because he knows, the Wall Street Journal just put an article out today that confirmed it as well, is that you can't pass this bill that he's talking about, the Clean Future Act, through reciprocity. It's going to require bipartisan support. And thus far, the way their bill was drafted, it has no bipartisan support on that. So what Kurt and I are sitting here quietly, and not smugly, but quietly, just building up support for bipartisan alternative. When they find out and they come to realization their bill's not going to go anywhere, then they're going to fall back, and we're going to have a solution that does meet those challenges, that we have support, not only in the House, but also in the Senate. And I would hope that the president would embrace it as well, because I think we're demonstrating anyone that is trying to do this in a partisan fashion, understand their bill is not going anywhere. It's Republicans, it wasn't going to go anywhere, and it's Democrats, it's not going to go anywhere, because they can't use reciprocity. So what Kurt and I are doing, we're developing something that is unlike any other bill out there. It's got broad bipartisan support, and we got stakeholders, and we've been working on this for years. We're ready to go.
You think there'll be numbers of Republicans that will join on, though, join you in this effort to address climate change?
Oh, yes, yes. We've already talked to numbers of them, because this is not just a simple bill. This is a complex bill. It's got, and one of the components of it, you have to please understand, there is some technology out there. Let me back up a little bit. We're not going to be able to get to net zero by 2030, 2035, or even by 2050 if we don't do carbon capture. IEA and other think tanks have been saying this for years. You have to have carbon capture. So if we're going to move in that direction, let's make sure first it's funded with that. So there's where we go with this, is how are we going to capture the carbon? And then even with the technology that may be available to us, what will be the incentive for a power plant or a manufacturing institution, a plant, to install it? Because there is an oddity or quirk under the Clean Air Act, is what's called the New Source Review Standards. And that has been a drawback for some interest in this. So right now, Kurt and I are trying to craft the language that will achieve both sides support. So because if we can develop the carbon capture, and we will ultimately, through innovation, we're going to develop the carbon capture. But if utilities and manufacturers are reluctant to install it because of the new source standard, the new source review standard, then we haven't accomplished anything. So included in this legislation, we're trying to craft out the very fine-tuned way that you'll be able to do an NSR just to apply to reduce the CO2.
Yeah. No, Congressman Schrader, it sounds like a lot of work. Whenever you're talking Clean Air Act changes, that law has not been changed since 1990. Just want to have you spoken with, I know there was a hearing today in the House Energy, one of the House Energy subcommittees, I believe, on the Democrats' bill, the Clean Future Act. Perhaps you were there today. Just wondering, have you spoken to Speaker Pelosi on this measure, or with Chairman Pallone of the Energy and Commerce Committee?
Yes, both Dave and I have reached out to Congressman Pallone. We did that actually last year when we were still adjusting the framework, and he was interested and said it was good work, felt that it had merit, and it'd be something they'd want to look at. As David alluded to, we're talking hopefully with Frank this week, at the latest early next week. Reached out to him today, briefed him on the general outline, which he thought was pretty good. Suggested that we reach out to the staff and make sure they understand what we're trying to do here. So we're setting the stage. We just recently got legislative language at the end of last year, and we consider this still a work in progress. There's a lot of detail in there. It's not a short bill, but we're hoping to engage folks like you all here, as well as industry, environmental participants, to fine-tune things, to make sure that whatever we do, it is actually doable and meets the goals of all concerned at the end of the day. But I think we're in a very good spot. The Democrats are interested in moving a major infrastructure bill forward. I think this is a great time for us to really bring things home.
Yeah. Have you spoken to the administration, and are there any companion efforts taking place that we'll hear about in the Senate?
I have not reached out to the administration yet. I think once we get things lined out in the House, then we'll be reaching over to the Senate. I mean, the Senate right now is the bipartisan institution. The House, unfortunately, is running a bunch of Democrat-only bills here in the near term. And I think it's going to be difficult to continue to do that. Can only do reconciliation so many times. So I am hopeful that this will be part of a bipartisan process. That's the only way to have a lasting effect. We did the Affordable Care Act with just Democrats a little over 10 years ago, and my Republican colleagues were able to successfully whittle away at that, I think wrongly, personally. But, the trick was we didn't really get bipartisan support. And I think this is something, as David has said, that he's worked on for 4 years now. I've been at it a couple years, and think we have great opportunity to bring everybody together. Our country desperately needs some major legislation in this area and needs to be brought together. And this is a great opportunity for that.
Well, Congressman McKinley, Congressman Schrader, I think, makes an interesting point there on what's taken place in the past on various pieces of legislation. In the aftermath of the enactment of the $1.9 trillion economic stimulus bill and its passage under reconciliation with only Democratic votes, what is your reading now of the political climate for major legislation like that involving climate change?
It's worse. Sooner or later, people have to be able to talk to each other. And as long as if people want to keep ramming partisan legislation past us, you can do that in the House, but it'll be stopped in the Senate. So it's not been pretty. And our concern now has to be, Bill, what happens? We got another issue that's coming up that's going to be very testy that will cause even further separation between the two parties, make that Iowa a lot wider than it needs to be. Are they going to throw out the Iowa election and disregard that and put in the candidate that lost on a certified election? If they do that, you're going to see a real breakdown in all communication in the House. But I want to go back to a statement you made earlier, but I was in that committee. I'm the ranking Republican on that environmental subcommittee that this morning we did have it. We went 3 hours talking about Frank Pallone's bill. And I saw quite a division on that, how that thing, but it was a lively conversation. It was healthy, but we could see that there were some real shortcomings in that particular legislation that needs to be massaged more so that it might be able to get some kind of support, but it's got to be bipartisan. But we went 3 hours with it, and we found a couple of things in it that were exposed that were pretty detrimental. That I'm not sure that everyone knew that they were in that bill.
Such as?
Well, there was it's a plastics component. This I'm hoping we can stay on environmental issues, but they were talking about plastics. And we found it's on section 902. And what we were saying was, last year, didn't we learn anything, Bill, about the need for plastic materials? So that we had gloves, gowns, masks, shields during the pandemic, and still needed. But yet under the bill, it says no new plastic manufacturing will be permitted in the United States for 3 years. I must be missing something because I don't understand the logic. What's that in an environmental bill?
Right. Well, you've said, I think you both have said there's room to maneuver. When you introduced the bill last year, they said that some aspects of your proposal are subject to change. Congressman Schrader, where is there room to maneuver here? Is it the target year, the 2050? Is it the level of carbon reduction, the prospect of new regulation at some point? Where might you be able to talk about some?
Well, as we get into hearings and listen to the different energy sectors, I think we'll probably refine, maybe some of the targets, the intermediate targets, the target dates at the end of the day. Make sure that the framework that we suggest is reasonable, and so we'll want to hear from folks on the environmental side as well as folks in the industry side. This is an imperative. We got to get after this now. This is not something we can be putting off, as we've heard from all the scientists and experts out there. So I think there's an opportunity there. I think we're going to have a good discussion about what energy regulation do we have or can we permit in the near term. There's no incentive for industry to commit to something like this if they're going to have to deal with multiple new regulatory processes that slow down innovation, slow down the advent of technology, or distract them from the mission. This is a tough goal for folks, particularly in the fossil fuel side of things. And I think we owe them the opportunity to deliver, as long as we're benchmarking them all along. And the benchmarks where we're open to refining those, making sure that they're aggressive but realistic. I guess that's the way I would look at it. They have to be aggressive, but they have to be realistic at the end of the day. And that's what we do with the hearings. That's what we do with reaching out to these various groups. So there's quite, I think, a bit that we could play around, but the goal is pretty clear and the intent is pretty clear. And we'll get those benchmarks and the ultimate legislation done probably over the next few months, I assume.
How can Congressman McKinley, how can you be certain that innovation will move at an adequate pace over 10 years without regulation to nudge it forward? I mean, what will drive this innovation?
Okay, but that's fair for people on the outside that don't understand that we've already, without further regulation, without additional regulation, we're already reducing our CO2 footprint. The United States is. As a matter of fact, something like over the last 10 years, we're about 16% reduction in CO2. That's without new regulations. You put that in context. That reduction in CO2 that we're doing without regulation, without additional regulation, is equal to the next 12 nations in the globe combined. So what the problem is not, we're already doing it. The rest of the world has not embraced this idea of reducing their footprint. So Kurt's mentioned it. I think you mentioned it. China is they're burning 5 billion tons with a B, 5 billion tons of coal. They just put on they're in the process right now of installing 250 gigawatts. That's pretty equivalent to all the coal-fired power plants we have in America. They're going to be building new facilities for that. So other nations are still going to rely on fossil fuels. We're seeing the European Union, that's going to exceed that. India is burning 1.1 or 1.2 billion tons. We're around 750 million. We're making the right moves. We're moving more into wind and solar and hydro. And we just want to make that, it's got to be more gradual, but to do this overnight, to do it in 9 years, to be 80% reduction, the only way you're going to do that is destroy families. And there was a quote I used this morning, and Bill, you're old enough to remember on the Vietnam War on the thing, but there was a statement used during the Vietnam War that says, an American general said, it was paraphrasing him, he said, we have to destroy the town to save it. That didn't work in Vietnam, and it's not going to work in America. By destroying our communities, these small towns, when there's no alternative for them to switch over to another, I don't think that's going to be, I don't think it's going to sell across America. And you're going to see Democrat and Republicans starting to rebel once they realize that we're not including in the mix all of the above. You're excluding fossil fuels. That's gas, coal, and oil.
I want to get to questions.
Could I answer that, Bill?
Oh,
Could I?
Please do, Congressman.
I think there's 2 or 3 key motivators without the heavy-handed regulation, ongoing regulation, new regulations, which would be suspended temporarily in this bill. Number one, this bill passes, there's a clean electricity standard in law. Okay, they have to meet that. If that power company wants to be able to generate power, they have to meet that, or they pay huge penalties and it becomes unsustainable for them not to meet that. So once this becomes law, they're vested. Their future depends on them making the investments along with the federal government. This is a partnership. They can't do it by themselves. We're talking tens of billions of dollars from the federal government to partner with these guys, much like we did with COVID. Let's make this a real endeavor, another moonshot, if you will. Second big thing is, I think that, if it's written in the bill that if you're not making progress, if we're not seeing progress, then we're going to go back to the old regulatory framework. That's not good. That's not, I don't think, conducive to these companies. So they're going to want to avoid that. And last but not least, the consumers are demanding it. A lot of the companies I talk to are already making huge investments in renewable energy or clean energy investments in their plants, because that's what the consumers want to buy. They want in Oregon, my utilities have stepped up to get carbon free, by 2050. I talked to some of, they can maybe accelerate that timeline. Look at, in the southern, it got this huge new nuclear plant. I mean, they're making, that's expensive. We ought to make it easier to build a renewable energy facility like that. So I think there's a lot of natural economic marketplace incentives, and the bill makes it crystal clear that you have to meet this energy standard or else. So there's built-in incentives here.
Yeah, and of course, there's interest in a clean energy standard across the board. It's something even the administration has talked about as well. I want to get to questions from the audience because we have a bunch of them. I got one quick one for you, Congressman McKinley. Have you talked to your colleague in West Virginia, Senator Joe Manchin, about this proposal? And if so, what does he think?
I've not talked to Joe, but our staff has talked to Joe. But I've talked directly with Shelley Moore Capito, and she's embracing it. And in fact, we expect that she will be the lead the Republican over on the Senate side. So that's breaking news today. We weren't going to announce that, but now you're asking how are we going to do this? She's going to be the lead on this. We know we're going to get, the Senate's going to work a bill. She's trying to pull together our support for more folks to be signed on to it. But we have to have something like this. It has to have a companion bill, and it has to be bipartisan.
Okay, well, let's jump into the questions. There's a bunch of them, and here's one, and I'll leave it to either of you guys to decide who's going to go first on it. But what reservation do you have with the carbon fee and dividend as a means of reducing carbon emissions?
Well, I can jump in quickly. I think carbon fees don't reduce carbon emissions. It's a tax, and the utility companies will just simply pay the fee and continue to burn carbon. Our idea here is we're trying to reduce the use of carbon. We're trying to reduce the CO2 molecules in the atmosphere. So the carbon pricing, carbon tax, chapter, they're not as effective as what we're doing.
Congressman Schrader, any thoughts? You agree on the carbon fee?
Yep.
There's also a few people have raised questions about transmission. There's a need for additional transmission to enable these technologies to become to be integrated into the grid. This member of the audience asked, where do parties stand on speeding up or smoothing the regulatory process to get these projects built? What can be done to incentivize state governments to pull in the same direction?
Well, it's not just it's not the state government so much, it's the landowners. I mean, that's our biggest hurdle to get over. I don't care if it's burying a pipe or burying electrical transmission lines. It's very difficult to get folks to allow that to occur over their land. Even out west, where I'm from, where there's huge swaths of land that farmers are using, it's difficult to get people to understand that. I think what we need to do, certainly if I'm part of the industry and frankly as an elected leader, is to capitalize on some of the horrible catastrophes we've seen this past year and again this spring. I mean, Texas had this huge freeze out. My own district in Oregon had a freezing rain catastrophe that wiped out energy and electricity to most of the folks in my county and neighboring county that I represent. I was huddled by the fireplace for 5 days. I'd like to have a little redundancy. I'd like to have some of these lines underground potentially. So we've got to figure out a new strategy for that. I'm hopeful that the LIFT Act that my David's and my committee is looking at would entertain a lot of openness to how to encourage transmission lines, reduce some of the regulatory framework. We do this we had some great hearings at the end of last year on pipelines and how to make sure that those are resilient and do the job that we asked them to do, and even more so now with the freezes we've seen down in Texas. So I think that something that we're going to be looking at very closely, but it's going to require a huge education campaign to folks back home that if you do not want to have another huge outage like we saw as a result of wildfires in my state, and then again with the freezing rainstorm, you're going to have to allow some of this transmission, some of this redundancy to occur going forward. We need everybody's help on that.
I think Kurt hit some of it. It's the landowners, but we also have the state government and governors are standing in the way on this. As an example would be New England. New England is starving for gas. And So as a result, they were trying to put pipelines in across New York, but Governor Cuomo stopped that from happening. So as a result, what happened in New England? Russia was providing LNG to Boston Harbor so that they could distribute it. That just runs counter to all our foreign diplomacy issues we're trying to do by bringing in Russian gas to take care of America's New England. We've got to find ways that everyone they can't be abused. The secondly is the environmentalists. Just I think we just have to be more careful how we proceed with this and get some reviews, expedited reviews, so that we don't get hung up in the courts.
You know, a few people have brought up the rather urgent message from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030. That's compared to 2010 levels to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Again, there's that 2050 goal that that's been set by the IPCC. In order to avoid, an increase in temperatures that the IPCC says would be devastating. Your goal, your 2050 goal falls short of that at 80% reduction in emissions. I mean, is that a cause of, do you worry that there's a gap there? Do you worry, do you take seriously that finding by the IPCC?
Bill, the problem is not America. Are your listeners paying attention to this? It's not us. We're going to get 80%, but we're not getting the other people to follow. The CO2, we're up now to 412 parts per million, and it's not all driven by America. When you have 5 billion tons being released in China and 1.1 million tons burned in India, those are the places where we have to go. So if people are worried about the whole overall temperature change and molecules into the concentration in the atmosphere, we need to have more of a global perspective on this. The United States is not going to be the driving factor that causes the problem. As a matter of fact, we've had testimony on Energy Committee a year ago, or 2 years ago, I guess it was maybe, where the expert panelists were saying, we asked them the question, if America totally decarbonized to zero by 2050, totally decarbonized by 2050, would we still have wildfires on the West Coast, flooding and droughts in the Midwest, and hurricanes on the East Coast? And all three of them said yes. So we're not the driving factor here. We'll play nice in a sandbox. We will reduce our emissions 80%, maybe even more. But until the rest of the world comes on board, this isn't going to happen. We're still going to have a global catastrophe.
Yeah, Congressman Schrader.
Yeah, so I would say sooner is better. And what I have seen historically is that once we set goals for various sectors of our economy, whether it's CAFE standards, or energy standards, whatever, the industry usually exceeds those. They're usually pretty good at getting ahead of the curve a little bit once they understand where we want them to go. As a business person, most business people can play by the rules, just don't change the rules all the time. That's what they're asking for, and that's what our bill delivers. We give them a set of rules that they can play by, and hopefully get to those near zero emissions in that time period. When we talk 85%, we got to realize, as David has said, we've already reduced emissions substantially here in the United States of America. You do another 85%, you're near zero emissions from our carbon power plants. That's a big deal. I would also say that if we get this technology and innovation going, I mean, we had the pharmaceutical companies step up and at literally warp speed, develop a vaccine in a year. That's unheard of. I'm a veterinarian, and it usually takes 3 to 5 years after a vaccine's even discovered to get it to marketplace. So I'm optimistic if we come up with the technology and innovation that gets us on that trajectory, we can get that to India. We can get that to China, to David's exact point, and hopefully accelerate that timeline so that we'll meet some of the concerns about the being too late in what we're proposing. And the last thing I'll say is it's better to be a little later than not get there at all. And without bipartisan buy-in, you've got nothing, and you just kick this can down the road, and the crisis gets worse, and it's going to be even tougher to get where we need to be. So I'm optimistic that we can get there, hopefully sooner than 2050, and we can get the rest of the world on board and help them get there too.
I understand there's a House vote about to take place in a few minutes, but I'm hoping maybe we can push further a little bit. But if I see the two of you need to just get up and run, I'll understand what's going on as well. Okay, if we ask a couple more questions here.
Let's try it. Let's see what we get.
Okay, let's give it a shot. A couple of people, or at least a couple of people, have brought up the question, why you focus only on the power sector. One person says power plants are only 1/3 of the problem. How do you reduce the other 2/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions? Another person says, in 2019, the majority of CO2 emissions in the US were in the transportation sector. Why are you focusing on making electricity carbon neutral rather than transportation?
Well, we're just biting off one piece of the puzzle. I totally agree with that question. Yeah, but 30%, that's pretty significant. In Kurt Schrader's book, that's a lot of, reduction in carbon emissions out there. And I would respectfully submit that a lot of the technology we're asking to develop would have application in combustion engines and the transportation sector. I think there's building efficiency stuff we can do. That's low-hanging fruit that our committee, David's and my committee, is discussing this year. There's obviously lots of other sectors, and I think if we can show a bipartisan way on the power plant side, there'll be other groups and people stepping up to make that happen in the other very critical areas that we need to address also.
Let me, because he's right on that. I agree completely. Things like battery storage, we don't have adequate battery. Ernest Moniz said just a year ago that we're not there for 100% on battery storage. We can't rely on that. We're too far away. So we need time. This is going to be this process of this heavy investment in innovation to be able to accomplish in renewables, hydro, all this business. So let's go back to this. And Kurt's right. It's about 30% of the power now is in the energy. But if we were to switch over, we're going to learn something how we're going to develop batteries, because batteries are one of the big problems, especially for automobiles. If you take a lithium in a Tesla automobile, that lithium is coming primarily from South America. It's processed in China, but primarily down there. And what we've discovered so far, to get enough for 20 automobiles, just 20 automobiles, they have to use 500,000 gallons of water to extract that out of the earth. That's water that could be used for the communities in Chile and Argentina. That could be used for agricultural purposes. So there's a real diversity. We've got to find alternatives from lithium and cobalt in our battery storage so that we'll learn from that in energy, and then we'll be able to apply it in the automobile sector as well.
Congressman McKinley, I know one of the topics that was taken up today at the subcommittee hearing was aspects of the Democrats' bill that had to do with worker issues, making sure communities that have lost jobs in the coal sector, for example, are attended to. One member of the audience asks, can we develop a plan to provide subsidies to wind and solar manufacturing companies to move to communities in West Virginia and elsewhere and provide worker training?
Of course you can, but that's it. The 48C that is being discussed is a possibility of a tax credit for companies to move there. Could that work? Maybe, but it's work. Do you have a workforce? Do you have people trained to do that? They don't have the parts there. So that means you're going to have to ship the parts in from some other part of the country. Then you're going to drive hundreds of miles to get to Welch, West Virginia, or Hazard, Kentucky. I'm just dubious that is going to be the best solution to do it. We have in America now, we have what are called opportunity zones that were put in place a couple of years ago. They seem to be working in some parts, but they're not working in other areas. So where we're seeing gas and coal, that hasn't been real effective in bringing in other investment for that. So on paper and on a laboratory or in a textbook, it might work. But in the real world, that's where you and I are living in. we haven't seen that being demonstrated as being likely that's going to take place. Because keep in mind, if you're talking about installing them there, that's one thing, because we don't have the same thing in Kentucky or Virginia or elsewhere. They don't have the adequate wind to be able to do it. So we would just be making a part and shipping it someplace else. Just be careful about when we go this route. The president of the International Laborers Union said, we're substituting jobs that are currently paying $70, $80, and $100,000 a year for jobs that are going to be paying $15 to $20 an hour. Is that he called it, and God, I won't finish it the way he did it, but he said it was just BS. It's not going to replace the income that's going to be lost to families on this. So again, I'm going to go back to the point. I want us to keep all of the energy that we're currently doing, all the energy sources, all of the above, and we'll find a way to be able to use coal and natural gas and oil in a cleaner way. We can do that, and it will give us reliability. We won't have the problem we had in Texas or California. We'll have those. We won't need all the extra utility lines that might have to be strung if you're become 100% dependent on renewable energy. We just need to be realistic about this and not be ideologically driven.
Right. Congressman Schrader, any tax incentives that may, I'm not sure that may be that probably would be out of the jurisdiction of this bill, right, as an energy and commerce bill, but a few people have asked if.
Right. That'd be more of a ways and means effort. Maybe, we could entertain something along those lines. But I think the bill stands pretty solidly on its own, has the right mix of incentives, and rather than spend a lot more taxpayer money, the goal is to encourage and if we're going to spend tax dollars, let's do it on innovation and research, just like we did here in the recent pandemic. That's where I think our get the best bang for the buck for the American taxpayer. And I just don't want to pay people to pollute. I agree with David on that. I don't think that's a great idea. So I think our construct, at least at this point, seems to be a lot more solid and better investment.
Yeah. Carbon capture, a few people are asking about carbon capture technology. What are the options if carbon capture technology development is disappointing?
Well, that's a risk that the industry is taking, the fossil fuel industry. They sign off on this piece of legislation. I think they see the future. As I said earlier, folks are wanting clean energy. People are not investing in coal plants because they don't see a future there based on the current discussion that's gone on. And to David's point, that can be catastrophic to communities, wipe them out. I've seen that in the wood products industry in my home state, where there was an overreaction to excessive cutting of timber. And now there's no cutting of timber, virtually none on public land. It's a tenth of what it was, 20, 30 years ago. And I'd suggest there may be some balance in between 100% and a tenth of a percent to get, or 10% to get that to where we need to be. I don't want us to do that to communities in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Texas or North Dakota or New Mexico. I mean, these are vibrant industries. There's a smart, sustainable, safe way to go about this. If we can get that carbon capture, carbon sequestration technology in place, let's give them a chance. This is, like I said, they're rolling the dice a little bit. They see their future is kind of bleak as it stands now. Let's let these communities be part of the 21st century American dream and not drive them out of business or into destitution. I think that'd be a criminal thing to do.
Well, some of that's already in terms of, you're seeing already a plant down in Texas, LaPorte, Texas, called Net Power. It's working in a way that's very efficient, using carbon capture. You're saying that we had it at Kemper down in Mississippi. That plant has had it. We just got to keep tweaking it. I believe in my heart, as an engineer and working with some of these scientists, that they're going to continue this. It's only going to get better. So I'm not a half empty guy on this, a half empty glass. I fully expect that we will achieve something. We're already proven it down at Net Power that carbon capture can be done, but it's only on a small scale. They want to upgrade that. I know it's up to 300 or 400 megawatts they want to go. So they're convinced that it's on the right track. Let's just continue to help it.
Yeah, Congressman McKinley, here's another question for you here. how will we impact, or he's asking how the U.S. would impact the reduction of emissions across the globe with this bill. Is there any carbon tariff or border adjustment that would leverage other nations to reduce their emissions? Again, I'm not sure that would be germane under your bill, but
Yeah, it's not, no, we don't have that in there. That's where we hope that the Paris Accord will be modified to be able to adopt that, because that's what we need to do. The rest of the nations have to click into this. And we're hoping some of that border adjustment might be, or let's just call it what it is. It's a tariff. Maybe that has to kick in, but you understand, once we do that, we're going to start another war with trade war with China if we do that. But we have to do something globally for other people. This bill will only provide the blueprint for other nations to follow. We'll have the technology. Right now, they don't have the technology. We have the most experienced work done on carbon capture. And it goes back to, you can't get to net zero without carbon capture, period. That's a widely accepted premise across this globe. So we've got to continue to lead that, and then we've got to market that to other nations around to adopt it once we mature.
Yeah, I know Congressman Schrader has to leave because of a vote, and
okay, they've called me. Yes.
And you as well, Congressman
Oh,
McKinley?
yes. Yeah, we vote the same way.
We didn't hear the bells ringing, but I'm sure they went off in the
I'm
background.
not sure we
here.
vote exactly the same way, but
Yeah,
we
not
vote at the same time.
there's still hope for you, Kurt. I'm still counting on you.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for your participation today. And it's an interesting discussion, and it's good to hear it happening on the Hill, that members of both parties are talking about this important issue. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. And our next event, Carbon Capture and Energy, Everything's Bigger in Texas, will be held this Tuesday, March 22nd at noon Eastern Time. For a full calendar of upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. We hope you enjoy this program today with Congressman McKinley and Schrader. And please enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.